Welcome to all our listeners. Ubuntunomics is a weekly roundup and discussion of the most important economic and political developments from Africa. Hosted by myself, Sia from PESA. PESA is a political economy think tank that promotes regional integration in SADC and provides research on the political economy of development in Africa. With me is my co-host, Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Isakombe Assets provides individuals with renewable energy assets in order to develop communities. With me is my co-host, Zama Matungandaba from M&M Legal. M&M Legal is a boutique commercial law firm which aims to be a primary advisor to small and medium enterprises, as well as an advisor to individuals on an array of private law matters. Hi, Sbu. How are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you, Sia. How are things today?
I'm very well, thank you. And hello, Zama. How are you?
Well, thanks, and you, Sbu and Sia. How are you today?
Very well, thank you. Very well. And starting our stories on the South Africa update this week, our first story is IEC Municipal Elections 2021 deposit amounts. The Independent Electoral Commission IEC has invited public comment on the proposed rates of election deposits for the upcoming municipal elections 2021. The proposed amounts are unchanged from those set in the municipal elections in 2016 and reflect a decrease of between 50% for independent candidates and those choosing to contest a single ward, and a 12.5% for those contesting metro councils, and a 20% discount for those contesting local councils since 2011. Under the proposal, a political party contesting all elections across the country would pay a deposit of $482,000 for a total of 4,725 elections and ballot papers on which the party and its candidates would appear. This compares to $605,000 for contesting all 10 elections in the national and provincial elections in 2019.
One wonders whether there was protestation over the amounts for independent candidates back in 2016. I just can't remember what happened back then. Now, why has there been no increase from 2016? That's a long time ago, in line with inflation maybe. I'm not advocating for an expensive form of democracy, but I am curious about the possible thinking behind this decision.
Sure. It seems as though it's quite normal for the IEC to provide a kind of discount, and I guess it is also the IEC trying to balance between being able to cover some of the administrative costs of the elections and ensuring that the candidates are well vetted, whilst also maintaining the cost relatively low so as not to create a barrier for entrance for those who want to run in the elections. So even in the last elections in 2016, they provided around 33% discount for parties in terms of the deposits, as opposed to which resulted to a below inflationary increase. And I guess with the deposit amounts or the prices or costs not changing since the 2019 election reflects perhaps what the IEC might be perceiving as a difficult economic environment and challenging conditions, which it's trying to assist with those who want to participate in the elections in terms of at least containing some of the costs of running in the elections.
Sounds good. Sia, I just have a question around this in terms of, are these deposits refunded?
Well, legally they are refunded if a party wins seats in the elections that they are contesting for, whether that's local or district in the case of the municipal elections or metros. And if the party or candidate doesn't win any seats, then they forfeit the full deposit amount. That's how these election deposits operate. Moving along to our next story for today. The first mRNA technology transfer hub. The World Health Organization, WHO, and its COVAX partners are working with the South African consortium comprising BioVac, Afrigen Biologics and Vaccines, a network of universities, and the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention to establish its first COVID mRNA vaccine technology transfer hub. The South African consortium successfully bid for the mRNA technology transfer hub following the WTO's global call for expressions of interest to establish the hub to scale up production and access to COVID vaccines. The WHO's call has received 25 offers from low and middle income countries who would receive the technology and produce mRNA vaccines.
This sounds like a positive development from President Cyril Ramaphosa's visit to the G7 summit, to facilitate the vaccine accelerator, to co-chair the story that we dealt with last week. Yeah,
definitely. And I think it'll go a long way in increasing or improving at least equitable access to vaccines on the African continent, and not just only, I think, the SADC region. What are some of your views on this, Boo?
My view, I don't have a view, but just an interesting point that the IDC, which is South Africa's Industrial Development Corporation, which is a finance institution, capitalized both of these pharmaceutical companies, both Afrigen and BioVac. Now, BioVac also has partners in South Africa, both in South Africa and internationally. For starters, they have the UCT, the University of Cape Town, as a partner, and CSIR. And then there is Sanofi, a pharmaceutical company from France, and Pfizer from the US, and Biofarm, which is an Indonesian pharmaceutical company. So it's just interesting that looking at these partners. Yeah, that's all I have.
Sure. There definitely is some connectivity there with also a lot of what we've seen on the political front, given the working visit by French President Macron, if you are to link it to some of the partners involved, as well as obviously the US's stance on the TRIPS waiver, which South Africa and India have been leading the way for in terms of pleas globally in order to expand vaccine production in developing countries. I definitely see where you are heading in some of those interesting observations you make.
Okay.
Our next story is privatization of Transnet SOC Limited. President Cyril Ramaphosa announced the partial privatization of Transnet State-Owned Company Limited with the establishment of Transnet National Ports Authority, the TNPA. The TNPA will be an independent subsidiary of Transnet and will be responsible for operating South African ports. Transnet will remain the owner and investor in national ports infrastructure, and Transnet has a plan to invest 100 billion rand in upgrading infrastructure over the next 5 years. This partial privatization is expected to attract private sector involvement to improve terminal operations and invest in new infrastructure.
Trade union COSATU say they're not pleased with this. First, they were ambushed about a week ago, they say, when it was announced that the government would have a minority share in the airline SAA. But the president has come back to say that the deal is not complete as yet, after there was some hounding from stakeholders. COSATU also are calling for the moratorium and a meeting with President Ramaphosa, rejecting this unbundling, as they say it is suspicious, and they are skeptical because the decision is not in line with the vision of the alliance and the ANC's manifesto. So there is this fixation with rolling back state the state's role in the economy. They say it is masked as SOE reforms. Now, my question is this only a matter of attracting private sector investment for the program that you mentioned, the 100 billion build program, or will there be a possible dilution of ownership as in the SAA controversial deal? Because President Ramaphosa has made assurances that the state won't sell the SOE. Now, at the same time, COSATU are saying we cannot take the President Ramaphosa at his word. So yeah, it's confusing to me.
Definitely. Look, I think what we're faced with here is a bit of political terminology in order to obviously deal with the perceptions around privatization, which hasn't been popular in the country. But if anything, if the historical experience is anything to go by, what we're faced with here is a partial privatization. So first things first is government will still maintain the ownership over the TNPA. However, it will be independent. So for me, it's not clear exactly where the independence will come from. But if I can compare this, for example, to the case of the 1997 partial privatization of SAA, is that what we're likely to see is that the services and operational functions of operating ports will then be outsourced to private players through this new TNPA authority, which in essence is basically a gutting out of Transnet's operational capacity in order to only leave a sort of a shell independent agency which will be involved in procurement of private services in order to operate the ports across the country. This is similar to what we saw after 1997's partial privatization of SAA, where the ground handling services of which used to be part of SAA's mandate were then privatized and now are squarely in the hands of private players. You're thinking of Bidvest and Menzies and other private companies. So I suspect that this is where the government is going. On the other hand, in terms of Transnet's continued ownership and the plans to invest 100 billion, government hasn't clarified where the funding and the financing for that's going to come from. But again, it's more likely to come from a public-private partnership. And government obviously will take the biggest chunk in terms of the liability. And however, what they're trying to do then is separate the balance sheet of ownership of the infrastructure and the financing operations, which will fall under Transnet, and the government and a government-sanctioned board in terms of accountability, versus the operating of the ports, which will fall under the TNPA with its independent board. But there's still a lot more that needs to be clarified in terms of how that board will be appointed and how we'll ensure that there's accountability despite the independence of the TP or the TNPA.
Yeah. Okay.
So what are your views on this one, Zama?
Hi there, Sia. Yes, Spoo. I note that COSATU is not very happy with the decision to go down this privatization route, and understand that this is just generally not very popular in South Africa. The population just doesn't like the idea of privatization much, as you've mentioned, Sia. But in recent years, we've seen with with all the issues that have come about with state-owned entities, that it does almost seem as though it is actually a need, for us to go into privatization, because our state-owned entities have been failing us. So and I agree that, with developmental projects, we will need a greater emphasis on public-private partnerships. But my main thing with this, Sia, is that, I see the government say this is part of our economic reconstruction and recovery plan. And, in essence, the objective of this privatization would obviously be to, increase efficiency, lower costs, and to improve and have new investment in port infrastructure. But as well, they want to, create more jobs throughout the export value chain and have ordinary South Africans benefit from lower prices of goods. So I'm saying that's all good and well, but I think to also assist with this, popularization of privatization, to actually make it more popular in the country, for people to actually see the value. I think the objectives that these projects try to achieve, whether it's the lowering of the prices, whether it's the creating of the jobs, really do need to be sustainable and really do need to have a noticeable impact and an impact that can be evidenced through factual data, so not just creating jobs for the medium term or the short term, when they're building that new infrastructure for a year or two, but actually creating jobs that are sustainable over the long term, that can actually pull people out of poverty, because then that would actually change the perception that people have on privatization, don't you think? Because I think that's where the government has gone wrong in the past, is that we don't really see the true development when these privatization deals occur.
I do agree with you partially, but I do also want to highlight that the South African experience of partial privatization also hasn't been good. For example, our partial privatization of SAA in 1997, which also went along with the partial privatization of Telkom, has had a divergent outcome. So on the one hand, I do believe that I agree with you. They need to have a plan for sustainable employment creation, sustainable developmental impact, but it's almost impossible when you involve a private partner, because the main reason why private sector would be more efficient than government is that they don't have a developmental or dual mandate on having a developmental impact as well as having a profitability, because the private entity is squarely just looking at profitability, which means they will maximize the exploitation of labor. Hence, what we've seen at Telkom over the years is a continual downsizing of Telkom. People have lost their jobs, whilst at the same time Telkom has been relatively profitable. On the other hand, it also depends what we privatize. For example, with the example of SAA, the airline industry is quite known, and this is from discussions I've had with professionals in the sector, that airlines don't make money from the actual tickets or seats on the airplane. What is the main source of income for airlines is actually the ground handling services. Hence, globally, if you look at all airlines, they will always take you back to their sort of home ground where they have an advantage. For example, on the continent, if you're taking Ethiopian Air, whether you're going to West Africa or Asia is immaterial. You're traveling from South Africa, you'll go to Addis Ababa, and from there you'll then connect to your final destination. Similarly, with Rwanda Air, you'll fly to Kigali, because that is where the airlines have a home ground advantage, because their sub-entities who are also owned by governments are involved and manage the ground handling, which is the most profitable for the airline industry. And other private airlines then who land in that space will have to pay. And hence, it's the ground handling services which are the biggest source of income. And if you look at the SAA partial privatization, it's precisely the ground handling services which have been privatized. And hence, part of the challenge of SAA, apart from the mismanagement issues, is the fact that they're now running an inherently unprofitable entity, because the biggest source of income has been privatized. And so it'll also depend now as to the port's value chain where most of the money lies. And I suspect it lies more in the operations of the ports, because the ports don't just service government entities such as PRASA, etc., who also operate through the ports, but also private entities which would then pay to use the ports. So I'm very concerned that we might be following the example of SAA, which ultimately doesn't resolve the problem of financial sustainability for SOEs, because by selling the most profitable sector or area of activities, we're kind of setting up SOEs to fail. And, so that's why I would agree with you to a certain extent, but not wholeheartedly. Moving on, our next story for this week is CPI rises to a 30-month high. The consumer price inflation CPI rose to 5.2% year-on-year in May 2021. This is from a 4.4% in April last month and reflects a 0.1% on a month-on-month basis. The main contributors to the year-on-year CPI were food and non-alcohol beverages at 6.7%, housing and utilities at 2.3%, transport at 15.3%, and miscellaneous goods and services at 4.1%. CPI excluding food, non-alcoholic beverages, fuel, and energy increased by 3.1% year-on-year and a 0% on a month-on-month basis.
Well, Sia, prices have been on the rise even since before COVID-19, and even before that, due to just the state of the South African economy. Things were just looking bad, and obviously the pandemic exacerbated matters. So the cost of living in South Africa has definitely risen, and so have the unemployment levels, which makes it quite a precarious economic situation to navigate for South Africans. So while we cannot necessarily go back to pre-COVID-19 normal, inverted commas, way of doing things, I think the government needs to rapidly normalize the functioning of the economy and come with new innovations to provide for efficiency to the system for a swifter recovery. So essentially what I'm saying is we need to recover, but it needs to happen quicker. And I think the government is a little bit relaxed in the way that they are handling economic recovery.
Yeah, I agree with the fact that cost of living has gone up, and it is also reflected in these figures because since last year, for example, things like sunflower oils have gone up, have shot up by about 30%. So things like tomatoes and beef and frozen chicken going up by 11%. So there is a lot of price hikes. There's quite a bit in these figures. I don't know what Sia reads into it, because some have commented that we should not be worried by the sudden jump, because the core inflation is still at 3.1% and still close to the South African Reserve Bank's 3 to 6% target range. Now, core inflation is an indicator of underlying long-term inflation, and it measures the change in the cost of goods and services, and it doesn't include these costs that I was talking about, the cost of food and energy. So basically what I'm trying to say is that we're still fine, because these costs, the food and the energy costs, are imported since there has been an increase in the price of Brent crude oil. So Sia, what do you think about my hypothesis of not having to worry about this jump for now?
Look, I think it's concerning, and I think because I'm trying to balance what you're mentioning with what Uzama also focused on in terms of the rising unemployment, the difficult economic conditions we're in. And so if people are paying a lot more for their food, housing, transport, and general goods and services, is that, the cost of living has clearly gone up. At the same time, people have got, less income as a result of higher unemployment. So from my point of view, it is a little bit concerning, but I don't think we're at a point where there's a necessity for policy action in the form of interest rate hikes or etc. But I also want to add that the movement in CPI or inflation that we're seeing is also linked to the tax and increases that resulted after April in terms of the fuel cost, in terms of the energy cost as a result of municipal and ESCOM recovery, which we've covered in a previous episodes. And if you look at the categories where most of the goods or the increases come from in terms of food and non-alcoholic beverages, that's a pass on as a result of the higher fuel levy and the higher fuel costs that we're facing. Housing and utilities, again, an increase in the energy costs that we're faced with at the moment. Transport, another signal of rising fuel costs. So what we really are seeing here is not necessarily concerning, but at the same time, given the difficult conditions we're in, the increase in taxes has really raised the cost of living, and the government's approval of the recovery from ESCOM and how that is then cascaded into municipal electricity rates also has pushed up the cost of living for South Africans at a time when unemployment is at record highs. So from my point of view, I am a bit concerned that the cost of living is increasing, but I don't think that we're at the point where it's necessary for government to then intervene in terms of the interest rate, but we'll just have to keep an eye and see what the Reserve Bank decides.
Okay, all right. No, I agree. I have just to mention that the price of bacon has dropped by 3%. So those who love bacon can take comfort.
Take comfort in the crispy love cost going down.
Exactly.
And then the price of vegetables, it has increased, you know, and garlic likes.
So all the healthy food seems to be increasing. That's an interesting one. All right. On that note, that brings an end to our SA update, and we're moving on to the Africa Regional Update. Our first story for the Africa Regional Update this week is the 59th ECOWAS Ordinary Summit. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, held its 59th ordinary session of the Authority of Heads of State and Government on the 19th of June 2021 in Accra, Ghana. The meeting considered various reports and commendations from the various ECOWAS organs, including on matters relating to the COVID-19 pandemic, regional security, economic performance, and implementation of regional integration programs. The meeting decided to adopt the Convergence and Macroeconomic Stability Pact between ECOWAS member states and noted the roadmap for the launch of the eco-currency by 2027.
I'd love to see this, as to me it signals a great progress on African integration. The currency development is very interesting, and I just have a question around what you think of currency integration, given situations such as Brexit, where the UK wanted to leave the EU, and sort of what potential economic benefits lie in countries or regions developing one currency.
Sure. And I think that's a very, very, very interesting question. And given the ECOWAS region and a regional economic community has two groups, really the process and the direction of creating a single currency is definitely going to be complex and difficult. On the one hand, we've got the West African CFA franc zone states, which all are at a more advanced level of integration because they're already part of the CFA West Africa Monetary Union, which has a single currency, which is the West African CFA franc, and has a fixed exchange rate regime with the French National Treasury. However, the other half of the community involves the West African Anglophone states. Here you're thinking of countries like Nigeria and Ghana, who are also relatively big but aren't part of the West Africa CFA franc zone countries. As a result, the countries will have to make compromises in their progress towards creating a single currency, apart from the actual, direct compromises they make as countries. So you mentioned the example of Brexit. One of the compromises that countries have to make when they have a unified regional currency is that they no longer have the flexibility to use exchange rate policy in order to adjust to external shocks arising from their export markets. And this is precisely why the UK wanted to pull out of the European Union, precisely because of monetary constraints, even though the United Kingdom still has its own currency. The fact of the matter is that monetary policy is directed by the European Central Bank and not the United Kingdom or British Central Bank. And as a result, this is one of the key compromises that countries need to make, in that they cannot adjust to external shocks. But at the same time, having a unified currency means that countries are trading with one another far easily, because you eliminate things like exchange rate risk. We also have the possibility to promote or encourage cross-border investment, etc. And this has been the experience in Southern Africa, at least within the Rand Monetary Union, or the Common Monetary Area, between South Africa, Namibia, Lesotho, Eswatini, who all accept the Rand in this jurisdiction, even though those countries' currencies are not accepted in South Africa. And as a result, these countries benefit from greater trade and movement of capital from South Africa and investment in their economy. So those are some of the trade-offs that countries need to make, and some of the benefits that come with a single currency.
This convergence and macroeconomic stability pact between ECOWAS member states still, to me, sounds very confusing, because they talk about the harmonization of monetary, financial, and fiscal policies of member states. Now, what is the ultimate goal? Is my ultimate goal of ECOWAS the dissolution of sovereign nation states that make up ECOWAS into one huge country? Or secondly, how does one achieve this harmony? Because especially around the fiscus, sovereignty to me and currency sovereignty for that matter are of utmost importance. So with all the competing demands of the different countries, how do they come up with a harmonious fiscal framework? I wonder.
So it starts off really simple, but it was also built on this notion of deepening integration. The idea is that they start off by liberalizing trade to create a free trade area. And once that trade is taking place, then you already have economic or commercial transaction amongst countries. The next stage is to then coordinate around a single customs process for the whole region, meaning amongst the members of the region, there aren't any trade taxes or import taxes imposed, and the region then imposes taxes on those countries which are not part of the union. Eventually, the idea is that this integration will deepen to the point of dissolving sovereign states into what is known as a political union. But there aren't any major examples of this, and there isn't any countries that have reached that level yet. As I mentioned with ECOWAS, the problem also is the fact that there are two groupings. The Francophone grouping, which is already at advanced level, given that they've established a customs union, whilst the West African Anglophone countries are still not part of this. So how they're trying to coordinate this is by coordinating policies, by setting targets. These targets start from things such as an annual fiscal deficit, which obviously has a knock-on to things like management of public debt. And the idea is that once countries manage their economies in a similar fashion, they then have or will face a similar type of economic cycle, and as a result then will generate buffers to deal with a downturn. You might remember a few years back there was a crisis in the European Union which involved countries like Greece and Portugal and Italy, which had faced a significant fiscal crisis, and that was a crisis that they couldn't stop despite having very clear primary and secondary macroeconomic convergence criteria which member states are supposed to abide by. And as it turned out, there was an expose that Greece hadn't actually met any of the criteria that it needs to meet in order to be part of the European Union as part of the macro convergence criteria. And it's precisely this challenge that makes it difficult then to harmonize across the region. But the idea is that once all countries meet the same type of policy targets, they then will have a harmonized policy, which will then harmonize the business cycle throughout the region. But even in cases where this is adhered to on the African continent, there are just targets that are set which aren't actually enforceable, because amongst the member states, the countries are at different stages of development, but also they face different positions in the business cycle. Some are in recession, some are in boom, and some are actually highly dependent on commodities, which means they're not in control of the business cycle that they face. And these are all things which undermine the harmonization. But the plan is to, once they harmonize, then to create a standard or a unified economic context that will deal with the compromise of not having currency sovereignty and policy sovereignty by creating harmonious policies throughout the region. But as I say, it's easier said than done.
Yep, they have set a date, currency by 2027. We'll still be here to
witness that, definitely. And I'm actually more interested to see how the compromise will be made by the Francophone countries, because they will have to find a way to get France to agree, if France does agree to extend the fixed exchange rate to the Anglophone countries, or they will have to compromise that arrangement in order to have the regional currency, which will then be difficult also to balance, given the fact that these countries rely on different commodities, from agricultural commodities such as cocoa and coffee in the case of Ghana, to oil in the case of Nigeria, and other commodities that are prevalent in the region, which do not actually, or make it difficult, as I mentioned, to harmonize across the region. But we'll still be here to see that play itself out.
Yeah.
On that note, let's move on to our next story for this week. Slow progress as South Sudan turns 10. South Sudan is marking its 10th anniversary of independence amid slow political progress and a range of humanitarian challenges. South Sudan's government has reconstituted the national legislature and appointed 550 new members, and also established a task force to oversee and coordinate transitional justice and other judicial reforms. However, the overall implementation of South Sudan's revitalized peace agreement has been slow since its adoption in 2018, against the backdrop of multiple security and political crises. Whilst the revitalized agreement provides a clear roadmap for peace through reform, political transformation, security, development, and national reconciliation, many of its requirements have not been met nearly 3 years later. In particular, the constitution of the Council of States and the nomination of Legislative Assembly Speaker are pending. Transitional security arrangements remain behind schedule, and pervasive insecurity continues to impede sustainable peace from taking root.
The violence we've seen in this country, in South Sudan, is not only between political adversaries. It is said to be intercommunal and among community-based militias. Now, do you think this country will ever achieve social cohesion? Because ethnic barriers between the various ethnicities seem to run very deep. It's one of those old African challenges.
Sure. Look, I must admit, it's a difficult question you ask, and really, I am personally disappointed with the progress being made in South Sudan, because it also kind of undermines what I definitely see as one of the core issues that have led to sort of intranational conflict. For the fact that the borders which we have were sort of arbitrarily developed as a result of the carving up of Africa during the race for Africa. But given that this is a new state which resulted from a referendum and really should reflect the will of the people, I'm still surprised that 10 years later, we still don't have much progress in the case of the state development in South Sudan. Again, though, I do admit that the process of state development is a very slow process. And yes, those entrenched ethnic identities will remain significant obstacles. But I think, as long as people can find a way to work with one another, find a way for proportional representation so that nobody feels left out or isolated, that we can move forward. But given the micro level of some of the aggression in terms of the violence, as you mentioned, community-based and being very linked to ethnicity, also makes it quite difficult to see what level of intervention is needed apart from actual state building, because control and the monopoly of violence is something that the state needs to establish. And given the duplicity and the number of so-called belligerent communities, it is almost difficult for a state to have continued or complete monopoly on violence in order to establish the peace and stability that's needed for state development to take root. So it's a difficult one.
Yeah, I mean, even drafting and agreeing on a constitution seems to be taking them forever in a day. Yeah.
Definitely. What are your views on this one, Zama?
Yes, I note the points that you make on this, and my view is that with given what you're saying, Sia, that we may not be at a stage to even know exactly which aspects require intervention, and also respecting all state sovereignty. But do you think that this is not an instance, or do you think there could be some scope for regional intervention here? Because I think that close attention should be paid to such countries, because it sounds to me that, as you say, they just turned 10. They have not even constituted their government properly. They've just appointed 550 new members, who knows how. And, when looking at that, don't you think that, considering that they're still fighting for liberation, things are still not certain there, there's still some violence that is occurring. Is this not where we can intervene as other countries and, assist? Because even South Africa, when we had to deal with apartheid, we actually did not deal with it alone. We had a lot of international assistance, so other countries are aware of what's going on. So part of me thinks that when we're silent, we become complicit to everything that is going on. And sometimes, if you've noticed, certain things will be more prevalent in the news. You know what I'm saying? So it will be, you'll hear about whatever the media wants you to hear about, if you get what I'm saying. So sometimes I think the brutalities are not put in the news, or they don't even make it to the media because they are not, it doesn't serve the interests of the right people. So I don't want to go too much into that sort of conspiracy theory, but I'm just thinking that, is this not a space where we should be looking for international and maybe regional intervention? Do you think?
Sure. We've seen, the African Union's involvement and as well as the United Nations involvement in the issue of South Sudan. And really, that has had some impact in terms of the progress, right? And this is hence where there was a revitalized accord which was signed in 2018, but that's pretty much been stopped dead still as due to the poor and the slow progress. Obviously, with the incoming new challenges such as the pandemic, as well as the impact on public debt it's had on the region and the countries, and the economic impact, a lot of the conditions and the economic conditions in South Sudan have actually worsened at a time when there was some turnaround, or at least we were almost getting some progress in investment in some of its oil exports, etc. and that has been dead still. There's some progress, at least from the IMF, providing a debt relief and some debt cancellation, really, in terms of the South Sudan's arrears to the IMF, which will create some fiscal space for development or investment in development. But I think really now at this case, we've seen intervention by the region as well as the African Union, as I mentioned. That's led to some progress on the political front. But now I think the progress is being undermined by lack of development. A few weeks back, we covered a number of similar stories, particularly in the Sahel region and the Great Lakes region, where Sbu and I were discussing how initially the view is that the conflict actually destroys infrastructure, destroys commerce, and makes it impossible for development to take place. But seemingly there's the other side of the coin, where the lack of development in Africa is also partially to blame for the inability for us to reach an end to the conflict. And we made the example of the DRC, where the lack of development of the eastern regions, where government literally has no access physically or cannot actually police in some parts due to their remoteness, etc., has actually resulted in the perpetuation of the violence. And I think that's what I suspect is taking place in South Sudan as a result of the poor and difficult economic conditions, and the progress now being undermined by lack of development, to put it one way. What are your views on this one, Smo?
No, you said something about oil. South Sudan is richly endowed with so much oil. They say only 10% has been found. So 90% of their wealth is still under their feet. They better be quick, because time can leave you behind. I'm saying that because the world is moving away from fossil fuels. So South Sudan needs to develop that country. And so they need a commodity to sell, because they don't have manufacturing. They have nothing except for natural resources. So if they don't make quick, countries are moving towards a carbon-free future, and in no time there might be no more need for that oil of theirs. So they have to be. They need to make quick.
I would say it's almost as though they need to be thinking way further. Even beyond the now, even as they develop their oil or some of their resources for exploitation, because without thinking beyond today, they won't be able to what is called leapfrogging, and be able to benefit from the development or beneficiation of their mineral.
Precisely.
Our next story for this week is the SADC Extraordinary Summit. The Southern African Development Community SADC held an extraordinary summit of heads of state and government on the 23rd of June 2021 in Maputo, Mozambique. The meeting considered various reports and commendations from the SADC Councils of Ministers regarding regional integration, cooperation, and development. The summit discussed, among key issues, the regional response and support to the Republic of Mozambique in addressing terrorism, regional food and nutrition security, gender and development, and progress in the regional response to HIV/AIDS and the COVID-19 pandemic. The summit endorsed the recommendations of the report of the chairperson of the Organ on Politics, Defense and Security Cooperation, and approved the mandate for the SADC Standby Force mission to the Republic of Mozambique to be deployed in support of Mozambique to combat terrorism and acts of violent extremism in Cabo Delgado.
Interesting development on the Extraordinary Summit, and also that it actually marks 40 years of SADC, and it's actually also really good to hear them putting the issue of Cabo Delgado to the forefront and what they can do to assist, and particularly even hosting the summit in Mozambique. I think SADC is at a good time to reflect on what it has done in the past, what it planned to do, what it's currently doing, and what it's going to do. I think the free trade agreement will do SADC very good, but personally, and I want you to let me know here, personally, I think that SADC as an entity should play a bigger role in pushing the boundaries of African development. I mean, I was just thinking ECOWAS has a currency plan. By 2027, they've decided that they are going to be, having one currency. Whether that happens or not, we'll be here to see it, but they've got a currency plan. So what is SADC doing to push the boundaries? I think, in 40 years of SADC, I don't know. Please help me, Sia.
Yeah, look,
I'm not saying that they haven't done things, and I know that they do. I know that there is work being done, but I'm saying that in celebrating 40 years of existence, and seeing the problems that Africa has today, but let's look at the region then. Don't you think they could be doing more as this regional community?
I agree with you, but I also want to say we can commend SADC for also being among the leading regions when it comes to what is really core and fundamental to the region integration process, which is intra-regional trade. SADC region's intra-regional trade is among the highest in comparison to other regional economic communities, at around 16 to about 21% of total trade. That's almost a fifth of all trade in SADC taking place amongst SADC member countries. At the same time, though, the deepening process has been quite slow. Fortunately, and this is almost a blessing in disguise, is that we are kind of getting the fundamentals right when you look at the progress we're making in terms of locating certain value chains. And here I'm thinking of the automotive sector in the Southern African region, which has now been able to be shared by a number of countries which are in the region. For example, the South African automotive industry is also linked to Lesotho and also linked to Eswatini and neighboring countries as well in terms of how it sources some of its inputs. And more recently, there have been plans to establish local manufacturing of medicinal and pharmaceutical products, which I think, again, will go a good way in our ability to remain agile as a region, to deal with future pandemics and also deal with future health challenges. The problem, though, is that recently SADC region has suffered quite severely as a result of natural disasters. If you think of the floods and the droughts we've faced on a cyclical basis. And on the other hand, more recently has been the rising issue of conflict, which is not a recent development in some parts, but has spread quite rapidly to countries throughout the region, which I think is creating is undermining the progress and continuation of deepening of integration in the region. So we can commend SADC for making the most in terms of intra-regional trade, but the progress in terms of deepening that integration has been slowed and is currently being undermined by some of the issues I've highlighted.
Sure.
Yeah, so let me get this one right. President Filipe Nyusi chaired a meeting that discussed problems in his own country, Mozambique, when his country have no means whatsoever of dealing with the challenges they face. It sounds to me like you have a beggar here, a beggar chairing a meeting. He's called food donors and blanket donors, and he's chairing that meeting. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but how can a positive outcome be expected out of this?
Look, on the one hand, the issue of the chairpersonship of Mozambique is a cyclical one because the chairpersonship rotates on an annual basis. And so on that part, it is kind of a coincidence, to put it another way, that Mozambique is a chair at a time when it's facing a difficulty. But remember, the complex issues in Cabo Delgado and the conflict is not a new issue. Last week, we were discussing how this has been taking place since 2017, we're now 4 years later. So it is a bit of a coincidence. But on the other hand, it is only Mozambique and the government of Mozambique which will be able to tell the region how and what kind of assistance they need. Obviously, there are sensitivities from the point of view of Mozambique, given the historical involvement of neighboring countries. We covered this a few episodes back where, in the late 60s and early 70s, leading up to the independence of Mozambique, countries such as Zimbabwe under Adam Smith and South Africa during apartheid had intervened in Mozambique and supported financially and otherwise the establishment of Renamo, which was the opposition to the Liberation Party Frelimo. And it's precisely on the backdrop of this historical context that Mozambique has become very skeptical of accepting assistance and military intervention from its neighboring countries. But again, as you've put it, if I may play on the sort of simile or the metaphor rather that you make, beggars can't be choosers in this case.
Yeah, I said this in a jocular manner, but it talks to power dynamics and how unequal partnerships they are not what I want to say is, in the region, you can't have so much inequality because these countries, like Mozambique, are only like satellites of South Africa. They serve South African interests. Their economies are so weak. It makes regional integration so difficult. You also had this in the EU, where you had Portugal and Greece and those weaker countries who were supposed to tussle it out with superpowers like Germany and France. So basically what I'm trying to say is that we can't have a currency. We can't have plans like a 2027 plan with weak countries like Swaziland, Mozambique, Lesotho. South Africa should assist in building up these countries so that they can make meaningful contributions, so that they are not beggars, so that we all become like equal partners at the table. It's more like what is happening amongst these countries is what is happening within the country in South Africa, where you have a white capital which is supposed to sit at the same table as a peasantry, a majority black peasantry. That the power dynamics are just too much. There's just too much power concentrated on the one side, and too much poverty and need and lack on the other side. So you have to bring these countries to sort of like an acceptable par. I don't know whether I'm making sense, but yeah, anyway.
I hear your point, but I do want to say that there are two issues for me. Yes, I accept, the inequality amongst countries makes integration very difficult. In fact, it's precisely on the back of different sizes in country that makes it unequal levels of development. But this is not new to SADC. This is not new to Southern Africa, because the same kind of story exists if you look at the European Union, where predominantly it's the West European countries which are funding the project of European development. And even amongst them, you could count maybe 2 or 3 in, for example, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, which pretty much bankroll the development of Europe. But I agree with you, it's almost when the countries get bigger and can compete at a much better level that the integration process seemingly becomes more seamless, and countries benefit more as a result of this. And at the same time, with this level of inequality in the SADC region does create a bit of a complex, in that countries, when it's tough, look to South Africa for assistance, but South Africa also has its own domestic challenges that it needs to deal with. And I guess on the other hand is the major issue, the fact that as countries amongst ourselves, are equal economically, this doesn't necessarily translate into political influence. So within the SADC region, countries like Zimbabwe still have a strong political voice, but from an economic point of view, they're relatively weak and cannot actually implement a lot of some of the political positions that they might have. And I agree with you on the point you're highlighting, that this inequality amongst countries does make it difficult for regional integration. Zama?
Yes, I love the comment. I love this topic. But I just wanted to also add on what you're saying. I think that it is actually emphasize that balance between the competitiveness of a country, that we as South Africa need to be mindful of our own domestic issues. And we need to we're obviously fighting to be a highly, competitive player in the global economy, but with that being said, we need to understand that we are part of this continent, being Africa, and more so if we're looking at it at a more granular level, we're part of this region of SADC. And as Spoo has pointed out, that how can you be happy being a success when your family is poor? In essence, you know what I'm saying. So we would be this global phenomenon being South Africa. But when you look around, Mozambique, Botswana, all these other countries that form part of our region do not compete. That does not really help us in the greater scheme of things, So I agree with you guys really on that. And I just wanted to emphasize to say, I really feel this point. I think that it is this crucial balance of being competitive as South Africa, as an individual country, but also remembering that we have to be competitive as a continent and more so as a region as well.
Sure. And you're both pointing to the fact that South Africa and the SADC region needs a bit of Ubuntunomics in order to balance this regional inequality and deepen our integration 100%. On that note, let me move on to our last story from the rest of Africa. And the last story is IMF outlines a road ahead for Africa. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, has outlined a roadmap for fighting the pandemic and dealing with debt in Africa. The IMF proposes a $50 billion plan that involves vaccinating at least 40% of the population in all countries by the end of 2021 and at least 60% by mid-2022. The IMF has provided debt service relief to its poorest member countries, and together with the World Bank is advocating for the Common Framework for Debt Resolution, which is designed to provide deeper debt relief to countries with higher debt vulnerabilities. Chad, Ethiopia, and Zambia have asked for debt treatment under the Common Framework at this point. At the G7 Leaders Summit, development finance institutions and multilateral partners made a commitment to invest at least $80 billion into the private sector in Africa over the next 5 years.
Is this proposed $50 billion plan that involves vaccinating at least 40% of the population, is that aid or is that more loans? Why are they shooting so low? I mean, at 40%, why not aim for herd immunity? Or do they expect the same continent, which they say is poor, to fit the other bill? The same continent that is experiencing difficulties in settling their debt. I mean, I ask this because the IMF specifically say that growth in Africa will be suppressed at something like 3.2% this year, which is half of what is expected for the rest of the world. So how will a highly indebted continent make up this shortfall?
Sure. So I hear you, and it seems as though the first immediate target, which is for this year, is a 40%. But next year, mid-2022, to reach 60%. The herd immunity averages, I think, globally are anywhere between 60 to about 70 or 75% of the population in terms of what is needed in the level of inoculation needed to enable herd immunity. So this to me seems like an earnest plan, but it's not clear where the $50 billion is going to come from and what kind of assistance this $50 billion is going to provide. Is it going to be debt? Is it going to be, donor funding? And so at this point, that to me hasn't been clarified, but it seems far more committed than what we've seen some of the national plans have been. For example, if you look at the South African vaccine rollout, we've made all the plans, but nothing seems to be taking foot. Nothing seems to be taking ground. We've failed completely in the implementation on the healthcare workers, and now we're trying to roll out towards teachers, which is also coming across its own teething and implementation problems. So it seems to be the IMF has got a far more committed plan than even some of the national governments have. And it'll be interesting to see where the support and then the financing and what kind of support they'll be providing. And it also is not clear as to, is this $50 billion part of the $80 billion commitment, or is it separate, meaning a total of 130? Mind you, this is also very, far paling in comparison to what the IMF has said itself that Africa needs. And I think the tune of the amounts there was somewhere close to about $500 billion in terms of the needed assistance for Africa to catch up to the vaccination or inoculation progress in the rest of the world. Zama?
Yes. So I think I was also with Spoo there to say I'm a little bit confused as to, or trying to understand rather, where this money will be, what it will be used for, what will be geared towards exactly. That's what I'm trying to understand, because I see that they are taking out debt, which obviously worries me because of, struggling African economies getting into more debt, right? Which means that, they will have to pay it back, which creates more obligations, and it's already tough as it stands. So I was just trying to understand where the idea behind this debt that is being taken out. Is it specifically just to get vaccines? But as you said, you're not sure yourself, but is it specifically to buy vaccines? And with that being said, I would just say that if they do get this money, they really need to focus, or when they get this money, I would hope that in their plans that they are taking more of a developmental approach in terms of capacity planning. So I hope that they do allocate the funds in such a way that part of it, yes, might need to purchase vaccines, because I know that we have issues around IP and the TRIPS waiver that we've been talking about, right? So we might actually be in a position where we have to purchase these vaccines, these other countries. Or are we in a position where, or can they balance that as well and make sure that they're actually developing the capacity, as South Africa is, as we've seen in our previous story, that South Africa is developing the capacity to actually develop these vaccines? Is it the same for these other countries who are taking out more debt and who are also seemingly going under debt treatment?
Yeah. A lot of questions. I guess we'll have to watch and see how this develops. But just a point of clarity, the local tech transfer hub, the mRNA vaccine tech transfer hub, is with the World Health Organization, and I think is a separate initiative from this IMF initiative. And with that said, I think there is still a significant lack of clarity as to how will this 50 billion assist in vaccination? Are we buying vaccines? And in some instances, even when the vaccines are available, due to infrastructure and inability of government to access every crook and corner on their geographic jurisdictions, some African countries just will need assistance with distribution and logistics alone. And at this point, it's not clear what and where the IMF interventions are going to be. Spoo?
What is interesting is that the 80 billion that you're talking about, the $80 billion that you're talking about, is a commitment by development financing institutions, which I take would be the likes of World Bank and IMFs and their multilateral partners. They've made a commitment to get this 80 billion into the private sector in Africa. not government. So there is this a global agenda to drive development or to drive commerce or economic activity away from the government into the private sector. So it's sort of like to privatize. It's a neoliberal. That's what we always call the neoliberal agenda. So it's very interesting, because what they could have been doing is sorting out Africa's debt with these commitments. Sort out the debt, and the only thing that will get Africa up on its feet is when Africa is fair playing fields where trade is based on fairness, and so where they don't dictate the price of our the prices of our commodities, where they let us manufacture our own, and not the World Trade Organization is very unfair to Africa. That's why with the lady that has been who heads the WTO now, we're hoping that some good will come of it, because this business of this global agenda to keep us enslaved and make us turn us into these perpetual commodity sellers, it won't work for us. Anyway, I'm very.
I could tell. I didn't even want to interrupt you there. Very, very heartfelt, this move. Very, very heartfelt. Look, some of these dynamics are market dynamics, and they'll always have a challenge of balancing, private sector, government, corporation. Look, the World Bank and IMF have seemingly supported African governments with the debt relief, but again, it's not enough. And ultimately, they should have just gone for restructuring from the onset, and the whole debt suspension and debt relief has been very diluted from what actually countries need. But let's hope that the common framework, and my worry is that a lot more countries will need to get assistance through the common framework. But they are trying to help on both sides. Let's see how this turns out. And it's a very, very, very difficult situation as to how these institutions can help, because it's a dual approach that's needed. One hand, we need a public health response, which is the vaccines. On the other hand, we also need an economic recovery response, which speaks to the role of government in supporting economic recovery. But we'll have to watch and see as these interventions unfold. On that note, that brings an end to our Africa Regional Update for this week. And to end off the episode this week, we have our numbers game. This week's number is 3,259.7%. What can you guys guess? What does this number reflect?
The size of Lesotho's GDP compared to the US. It's a big number.
The size of Lesotho compared. Okay, so you compare the US economy to Lesotho 3,000 times. Okay. No, sorry, that's not the one. Any guess from your side, Zama?
The total percentage in which households' incomes have dropped ever since hard lockdown from April last year.
Wow. Again, no, but that would be very, very concerning if incomes have dropped by 3,000%, because now with the weaker lockdown, we have some economic activity. But no, okay, so this week's number is 3,259.7% increase in tourism income. So the total nominal income for tourist accommodation industry increased by 3,259.7% year on year in April 2021, and increased by 33.9%, almost 34% on a month-to-month basis. All accommodation types recorded large positive year-on-year growth, in income from accommodation. The largest year-on-year increases in income from accommodation were reported by caravan parks and camping sites and guest houses and guest farms. So that's quite an interesting number, which shows that there's some recovery, at least when it looks at domestic tourism in South Africa, which also speaks to the fact that we moved away from last year's hard lockdown to where we are, but also signals some level of improvement in the domestic economic activity, given that the tourism sector, as a result of restrictions, was among the hardest hit due to the global lockdown and the pandemic.
Geez, that's a massive number. It means there was actually no revenue whatsoever.
Last year, definitely. Yeah. On that note, that ends our episode this week.
Share.